distinguished people here who have come to lend your presence to what is the launch of a very important book. Kwesi said a few things, and he said that the issue of reparations is not just about monetary compensation. It's about history. It's about recognizing the grievous harm that was done to the content of Africa by the slave trade. When he asked me to write the foreword, what I didn't tell him was that his fufu had fallen into my soup. Because from 2023, I got an invitation to Nova Scotia. Why I was invited, I didn't really understand. But it was a conference of African universities studying reparations. And so in 2023, that's where my interest in the issue of reparations was ignited. And so he didn't know I was stepping on the stone when he came and said, "Can you write the foreword for my book on reparations?" Of course, I was gradually becoming a scholar myself on the issue of reparations, so I gladly accepted. And I had come back from that conference with loads and loads and loads of studies on reparations. So it made it very easy for me to just belt out that foreword for him. And when he came to Malabo to pre-launch the book, we ordered some copies, and I very happily distributed it amongst my fellow presidents. What I have to admit to him is that because I couldn't find him of his absence when I distributed the book, they asked for an autograph, but the author wasn't there, and so Kwesi, I autographed on your behalf. So if you find a few copies of your book with my autograph in it, then I am seeking your permission to have done that. He referred to Sarah Batman, and he talked about a woman with significant backsides. I'm sure we all have sisters and wives. I can particularly testify. And because of the Caucasian physique was for flat bottoms. And so this was seen as extraordinary that a woman should be so endowed at the posterior. And so, like he said, she was taken to Europe. She was South African, and she was taken to Europe by two people who promised her a good life and a lot of money if she would play along. And so they exhibited her in a cage, like an animal. And people will come and look at her. She would have to undress to show her posterior. And people will come and look at her and laugh and jeer and do everything. Eventually, that woman committed suicide. I mean, the humiliation, the degradation was too much to bear. He also gave the example of the woman from Elmina, Monica Fernandez, they called her. In those days, when they baptized you, they discarded your native name. So we don't have on the record what her actual native name was, but she was baptized in the castle. And once you were baptized in the castle, you were supposed to live a pure Christian life. She was bitten by a cat, and the injury was festering. And so, I mean, like all Africans would do, she went to a herbalist to see if she could get a cure for the cat bite. And somebody went and reported her that she had gone to a fetish priest. And so they accused her of witchcraft. And they had a court in the castle. So the trial started in Elmina Castle. And the appellate body was in Portugal. And so at a point, the the judiciary in Elmina Castle decided to refer the case to the appellate body in Portugal. And so she was transported to Portugal to continue her trial. And so she was found guilty of witchcraft, but she was given a light sentence. And the sentence was Christian re-education. And so she had to undergo Christian re-education to cement her faith. And eventually she was discharged as being a reformed prisoner because she had imbibed the Christian ideology properly. But she wasn't brought back to Elmina. She was abandoned in Portugal until she died. So these are just individual examples, but they are living examples of the humiliation the African person faced in the period of the slave trade. Cabral has done a beautiful review of the book, and Kwesi also spoke. And all of them mentioned the Middle Passage. The slaves, when you go to the castle, we go there as a tourist experience to educate ourselves, but also to enjoy a day out. But we cannot imagine the unspeakable horror that our people had to go through. Those castles. And you see the door of no return. They show you this is the door of no return. And once you went through that arc, you were loaded onto a canoe. The ships were offshore, and they took you onto the ship. And for those of you who have studied history and the slave trade, you would see designs of how the slaves were packed. There were several floors, and so they could take you to any of the floors. They tied the men separately, the women separately, the younger teenagers, infants separately. And the shackles were on the floor, and so you had to lie down, and your hands were shackled, your legs were shackled, and so you could virtually not move. The passage from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas typically took between 80 to 90 days. So imagine being shackled in a ship for 80 to 90 days, unable to move, unable to sit, just lying on your backside. They come with a little food, open your mouth and slap something into your mouth. You are forced to swallow in order that you can survive. And in many cases, illness broke out on the ships. And when people were too ill to continue the passage, in order not to spread whatever illness they were suffering from, they were thrown overboard in what was called the Middle Passage. Now, if you look at estimates of the trade, Kwesi stated about 12 million. But if you do the math, the average slave ships took between 400 and 600 slaves at a time. And it is estimated that there were about 36,000 slave voyages between 1514 and 1866. So if you look at 36,000 slave voyages with an average of 400 to 600, the estimate will be much higher than 12 million. And if you landed your slave vessel with 20 to 30% loss, that was acceptable. And so if 36,000 slave voyages with almost close to 20 million people were carried across, and there was a loss, acceptable loss of 20 to 30%, then you are looking at deaths of between 3 and 4 million people who didn't get to the destination. And the horror of the slave trade was felt on both sides of the Atlantic. Families that lost their parents, both mothers and fathers. And so a lot of children were orphaned, because their fathers and mothers were enslaved and forcibly removed. And so, on the other side, relatives who were torn from their families forever and had to be auctioned, and there was a slave market. They tied you to a stake, and the white plantation owners would come and inspect, open your mouth, look at your teeth to see if any of your teeth are falling out, raise your armpits and all that. I mean, just like you buy a sheep in the market, and eventually if he decided to buy you, he took you, and like they always do, in order to enslave you completely, they change your name. And so that's how you can become Cassius Clay, because your slave owner was called Clay, and he named you Cassius. And yet your African name might have been something completely different. For those of you who have watched Roots, you remember Kunta Kinte, when they tried to force him to change his name. So these are a few more details of the slave trade and the issue of reparations. And I think that Kwesi's book is a very important contribution to the struggle for reparations, not only, like he said, in terms of monetary compensation, but also in terms of making people remember that history. There is something in history we call revisionism. Revisionism is when a government adopts a particular policy to try to rewrite the history according to how they want people to remember it. And I'm sorry to say, we saw a bit of revisionism in Ghana, where the issue of the founder of Ghana and the role of different political movements, and a new curriculum was written, and somebody's name was removed and reduced to one sentence and things like that. That is also revisionism. But even in terms of the slave trade, there's revisionism going on in this country. And not in this country, in this world. I don't know how many of you have visited the Smithsonian in America. I have. And it is such a beautiful documentation of American history. It starts from the early period of America, when it was only the Indians there, how they arrived there, how they settled, their way of life, and their beautiful exhibits. And then it moves from that period to when the migrants started coming from Ireland and other places, the Pilgrim Fathers and all of them, and settled on the West Coast. It also captures the early building of the railways. It captures the slave trade in detail and has exhibits on the slave trade. It captures how there was a push from the west to the east coast and how the Indians were dispossessed of their land. But it also has a lot of modern exhibits. The Apollo moon landing, the exhibits are there. The first computer that was built, you would learn about it. And so there's a lot to learn. And if you have been following the news, recently somebody said, the Smithsonian has too many negative stories. That is revisionism. And so if you go to the Smithsonian, you come out depressed. But that is your history. That is the truth. But of course, that is a way of attacking the Smithsonian and saying that, okay, take some of those adverts that are negative of America so that we can go through and see a happy story and we lived happily ever after America, and that is the intent of, going at the Smithsonian. And it's not only the Smithsonian, Black African Month and all that are all under attack by a new group who say they are tired of being politically correct. And so they must be left free to express their racist views. And so all these are happening. And so the reparations movement is being resisted. And like Kwesi said, we all saw the genocide. It was horrible. And I've watched documentaries on Auschwitz and how people were led like cattle into the gas chambers. And they were giving a different story that they were going, to be employed and paid and, to have a nice place to stay as prisoners. And yet the people running the camps knew that you were packing them into a place to gas them and kill them. Women, children, men. That was horrible. But like it was said, it's documented that 6 million people were affected. The slave trade was almost twice that. And so, like Kwesi said, if you can restitute for that, why can we not demand restitution for what was the most criminal human enterprise known to history? And today, in the world, there's still genocide. We're seeing images that are reminiscent of what happened in the Second World War. We're seeing emaciated children. We're seeing people being starved slowly. We're seeing people being displaced. We're seeing people whose homeland is being converted to be turned into a Riviera. And we must have the courage to speak about these things. And so those were just a few comments I made. I have a speech here. I don't know if I should still read it. But I guess I should for the record. So here goes. This evening's gathering is both solemn and celebratory. Solemn because the subject matter, reparations, compels us to reckon with the unfinished business of history. Celebratory because we are here to honor the tireless scholarship and activism of Mr. Kwesi Pratt Jr., who has gifted us this monumental work. The title of the book itself, Reparations, History, Struggle, Politics, and Law, captures the breadth of the challenge before us. Reparations are not simply about money. They're about truth. They're about justice. They're about healing and the reordering of the global system that has for centuries been built on the exploitation of Africa and her people. In the foreword to this book, I reflected on how the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and the structures of racial capitalism were not accidents of history. They were deliberate and coordinated systems of plunder supported by religious edicts, enforced by colonial armies, and legitimized by political institutions. Yet, as the author, Kwesi Pratt Jr., eloquently shows, Africans did not passively endure. From Queen Nzinga to Yasantiwa, from the Mau in Kenya to the Edo Kingdom, the Frantic Confederation, the Amazons in Benin, to our Pan-African visionaries like Nkrumah and Cabral, our ancestors resisted. They fought with courage, intellect, and faith, leaving us a legacy of agency and resilience. Reparations are not charity. They are moral, legal, and political obligation. As I said recently in Canada, the world found the resources to rebuild Europe after World War II, to compensate Israel after the Holocaust, and to reconstruct Japan after the Hiroshima bomb. Yet the greatest crime against humanity, the enslavement of millions of Africans and the pillage of a continent, has never been fully addressed. Reparations must therefore go beyond financial compensation. They must restore historical memory. They must affirm spiritual dignity and drive systemic reforms of the global order. They must inspire curriculum changes in our schools, structural reforms in global trade and finance, and a reimagining of international governance. I speak here not only as the President of the Republic of Ghana, but also as the AU champion for reparations. The AU has rightly declared reparations as the theme of the decade. And I must say it was the theme for this year, 2025, January to 31st December. But when we went to Addis the last time, the decade from 2025 to 2035 has been declared by the AU as the decade of reparations. This is a call to action. We cannot continue to accept global double standards. Africa must demand fairness, equity, and justice. We must push for transforming the UN and other international institutions to reflect the true equality among nations. Kwesi's book is a decisive contribution to this global struggle. As I said, it is not an easy book. It unsettles you, it challenges, it demands, but it's also a hopeful book. It affirms that the reparation struggle is both urgent and transformative. On behalf of the people of Ghana, I salute Mr. Pratt for his scholarship, his courage, and his lifelong dedication to the Pan-African cause. The struggle for reparations is not merely about the past. It is about the future. It's about building a just world where Africa and her diaspora stand tall, not as victims of history, but architects of a new and equitable order. As we launch this vital work today, let us all recommit ourselves to this cause. Let us mobilize our youth, our women, our intellectuals and diaspora communities, and let us carry forward Nkrumah's vision and our forebears' sacrifice. Reparations are not a dream deferred, they are a demand whose time has come. And I thank you all for being part of this historic moment. May God bless Africa, may God bless Ghana, and I have the privilege to launch the book, Reparations, History, Struggle, Politics, and Law. Author, Kwesi Pratt Jr. Why? Today, no fireworks. They have some cheer. So I declare the book duly launched.